West Texas at dusk feels like a held breath. The land out past Highway 90 stretches so far and flat that it ceases to resemble landscape at all. It becomes something more elemental: light, air, sky, and silence. Between the small rail town of Marfa and the distant Chinati Mountains to the south lies a shallow basin known as Mitchell Flat. Dry grass and creosote fill it. Scattered brush creeps over the basin floor like tones on an untuned radio, irregular, barely alive, yet always present. It's here that the lights appear. White, sometimes red, hovering just above the desert floor. Some say they flicker like lanterns. Others say they move like fireflies trapped underwater, fluttering in the near distance, yet unreachable, too smooth and too steady to be anything natural. The first documented sighting came in 1883, scrawled in the journal of a Confederate cavalryman turned surveyor named James A. Roberts. He was camped east of Marfa when he saw strange lights darting across the horizon from the south, not like stars nor firelight, but as if held aloft by invisible men. He thought it was Apaches signaling each other in the hills, a presumed threat, but it never came closer. Nor did it go away. Even then, he noted something others would echo time and time again. The lights made no sound. No rustling of grass. No crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not even the faint hum of wind. The air simply stopped moving. The Apache, of course, had no use for Robert's theories. Long before pioneers dragged wagons across this part of the desert, the Lipan and Mimbreño had avoided the flats completely after dark. In what oral history survives, they speak of ghost wind, a presence that rides the silence, not harming but watching, testing travelers' intentions through pattern and patience. If one approaches, you turn back. If more gather, you stay still. But if three come and the air goes completely still, you wait. You must not speak. Not until they pass. That rhythm, the pale flickering in threes, has become the sign that separates stories from warnings. Locals have tried to offer answers over the years. Highway mirages. Heat rising through chalky soil creates distortions, one theory says. Others blame car lights bouncing off distant roads, which is plausible until someone points out that sightings far predate vehicles. Even the U.S. Army tried to chase the lights once, an anecdote passed down from a 1943 mission no one will confirm on paper. The soldiers saw them flicker over the flat, moved toward them, and found nothing where they'd been. No pathways, no footprints, the basin floor undisturbed. Those who see them often speak in low tones afterward, as if they've seen something ancient they weren't meant to notice. They'll say things like, "The lights don't come every night, just the quiet ones," or, "If you're not looking for them, they'll find you." Folklorists tend to catalog these statements as cultural myth, atmospheric folklore born from isolation. But the stories don't vary much. That's what makes them so strange. Whether told by ranch hands, retirees, teenagers out sneaking beers near the old pull-off, or oil workers passing through, most retellings follow the same formula. One light appears first, still, usually white. A second joins, either drifts or mirrors the first. Then a third. This one holds, lingers. Then the wind stops. That pause, that's what sticks in people's memories. A stillness that feels bigger than the desert. Like something vast and old has stepped into place where nothing should move, and it is listening. Locals say you can feel the air pull back when they begin to show, like the night itself is leaning in. Mitchell Flat isn't marked on most tourist maps. There's an informal viewing area outside Marfa off Route 90. There now stands a paved observation platform with telescopes and signage. It's popular in the summer. It was added in the early 90s following a boom in interest, back when people still tried explaining it with science. But the real sightings never happened from that platform. They happen deeper in the field, east, toward old fence posts still marked with sun-bleached red cloth strips tied by ranchers who long stopped working the land. The cloths blow, or don't, and that's often your first clue that something's nearby. When the breeze stalls and the cloth stops moving, even when everything in your ears says it's supposed to rustle. Many of these red cloths have been replaced with plastic over time. Some have simply disappeared, buried in dust, or swallowed by desert. The markers mean different things to different people. Boundaries, some say. Another layer of folklore built atop the lights. that if you pass the third marker and speak, you can't come back the same. But folklore or not, people respect the rule. Ask any longtime resident of Marfa and they'll shrug, offer a tight smile, and say, "We don't go out there after dark unless it's necessary." Press them further, and you might hear stories about a boy who wandered too far and came back barefoot, silent, covered in the kind of dust that doesn't resemble anything nearby. Or about a deputy who refused to log certain calls beyond mile marker 19, chalking them up as not accountable through conventional means. In folklore, patterns matter, not just because they repeat, but because something wants them to. And so the lights continue. Not every night, not timed, but always in threes, always in silence. In October of 1976, a graduate student named Candace Harmon, trained in folk narrative and abandoned traditions, drove into Marfa looking for nothing more than a man long thought dead. She came with questions. She came trying to explain her way out of her own uncertainty. What she found was not the answer she expected, but a pattern that already knew her name. Before her journey was over, she'd see the third light hold. She would feel the wind leave, and she'd learn the difference between watching something and being remembered by it. Out past the roads where fences fall away and nothing forgets. It came in a plain manila envelope, the paper brittle along the edges, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before someone finally decided to send it. No return address. Just a Marfa, Texas postmark, stamped 3 days prior. October 12, 1976. Candace Harmon sat alone in her Austin apartment when she opened it. Fan humming in a slow, crooked circle above her. Lights soaking through yellowed blinds. Her thesis notes stacked in quiet defeat on the floor. 2 years of field research in oral traditions, mostly unpublished. She hadn't looked at any of it in weeks. The envelope contained only 3 things. A hand-sketched map drawn in smudged graphite. A note card with 9 numbers, coordinates, maybe, and a short letter. No greeting. The handwriting slow, deliberate, cramped as if written by someone who hadn't held a pen in a long time. Bring your gift. You'll know when to stop. I need you to see what I saw before the third light. W. Givens. It was impossible. Walter Givens had been declared dead since 1972. His car was found abandoned along a service road outside Alpine nearly 8 years ago. Door closed. Keys missing, spare boots still in the trunk. There was no goodbye, no known conflict. Only a moment when he failed to return from his sabbatical in the desert. They never found a body. Candace had worked under Walter in graduate school before he vanished. She had admired him, his methodical mind, the way he taught folklore without mysticism or mockery. He never chased stories for drama. He taught her that all folklore hides systems. Hidden warnings in repeated structures, superstitions, yes, but often built by generations who paid dearly to observe rules no one explained out loud. He'd called them quiet agreements. He once told her, patterns don't form by magic. They form out of fear. They stay because somebody, somewhere, got very good at not dying. So when he disappeared, she didn't believe it was suicide. Back then, she wanted to search for him. But the school moved on. Departments shifted. Walter's name became a footnote. His final research, an open-ended grant to explore West Texas oral traditions, was boxed and shelved. But now, here was this letter. The map was centered around Mitchell Flat, just east of Marfa. A line had been drawn in a spiral around a point marked with the letter X. Around it were faint notations. Silence begins. Don't record voice. And 3 equals remember. That night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the paper, tracing the spiral with her finger again and again, remembering something Walter once said in a hallway long ago. If you hear a silence that doesn't belong, don't ask questions. Just stop walking. She left Austin 3 days later. No formal plan. No permit. She packed light. 2 changes of clothes, a field recorder, her journal, compass, water, a borrowed camera she didn't intend to use. She didn't tell the university. This wasn't for her thesis anymore. The drive west from Austin stretches like slow, unraveling thread. The sky grows larger with every hour. Pines fall away. The air dries. Mountains sleep in the distance like bleached bones half buried. Past Del Rio, the radio turned staticky. Not from distance, but from depth. The moment she passed Sanderson, something shifted. The towns grew smaller, older, softer around the edges. Some without names on the signs anymore. Dust collected in ways that felt arranged. On the final stretch of Highway 90, the sun fell fast. As she passed the outskirts of Marfa, she pulled into a weathered gas station surrounded by nothing but failing fence and brittle sky. Inside, an older woman at the register handed her change and stared longer than she needed to. "You hear about the lights?" the woman asked, not curious, but tired. Candace faltered. "Just research. Old stories." The woman gave her a long look, then glanced out the window eastward. "Stay behind the mile markers," she said. "If the wind stops, don't look up." Candace nodded, unsure what to say. She made a note of it in her journal when she got back to the car. Words like that, in these kinds of stories, were never casual. She pulled over just before mile marker 18 and waited. Desert breath all around her. Her windows down, the air oddly warm and mineral-rich. No noise, just a soft rustling in the brush. Then the wind paused. Just once, long enough to notice. In the mirror, the red cloth tied to a nearby fence post fluttered once, paused, then twisted slightly, as if being turned by hand. Nothing came. No flash. No glow. Just the stillness. Candace held her breath. And in that moment, she began to understand what kind of fear this place held. A fear that was not theatrical, not cruel, but attentive. She set up camp just east of the observation point where the official telescope platform had been constructed. But she didn't trust it. The stories never happened from there. It was for tourists now. And Walter had never believed in official versions. The exact coordinates he left led to an unpaved stretch of earth not far from the road. Overhead, the stars speckled across the sky flint-sharp and dry. The Milky Way bloomed clearly, unblurred by haze or light pollution. Every hill and shrub stood in silent relief against the starlight. She placed a stone at the center of her camp, then walked out exactly 47 paces and marked the edge with a second one. Ritual, she told herself. Boundaries. If this was a pattern, she needed to learn its shape before she dared approach the center. Before bed, she flipped through her research notebook, the old one, used during her time under Givens. She found a margin note he'd once scribbled beside a myth from the Faroese Islands. All things that come in threes are either questions, warnings, or doors. She circled it again. That night, she dreamed of wind moving backward, slowly pulling time like thread through bone-dry fingers. There weren't voices, just a rhythm, like a breath held slightly too long, waiting to see what would break first. She awoke near dawn on her back, hands stiff, her boots covered in fine soil she hadn't touched the night before. And somewhere far across the flat, a single point of light hovered, barely moving. She counted. 1. She didn't raise her camera. She just watched. And something watched back. Walter Givens was waiting in the gravel turnout east of Mitchell Flat, where the crumbling fence bows inward toward the arroyo. He stood by a rust-colored truck with mud-caked tires, staring west and slightly upward, as if tracking something no one else could see. He had always been tall, but thinner now drawn. His coat flapped slightly in the wind, though his body didn't sway. He wore sun-faded jeans, sharp-angled boots, and heavy square sunglasses just opaque enough to hide his eyes, though the sun had already tucked behind the Chinatis. He didn't speak at first. Candace stepped from her car, careful with the way she closed the door, quiet, respectful. Something about his posture felt held, braced, like a man returning from a long dream and unsure what part of him had come back. "Walter?" she asked. He flinched then. Not hard. Just a tight turn of the mouth. A nod. "You came," he said. "I got your letter." "I didn't send it," he replied, voice as dry as the dusk around them. "At least, not recently." There were no embraces, no explanation offered for his disappearance. Not yet. His next words came like commands spoken by someone checking boundaries not quite visible. "Leave your camera in the car. Bring the journal, not the recorder." He turned and walked toward a low mound of limestone just past the marker fence. Candace followed. They sat on cooled rock. The moon not yet risen. Around them, all was purple-lace shadow and the quiet susurration of sage and low grass in the breeze. He faced the open flat. Always the flat. "I came out here to close an investigation," he said. "Instead, I stepped into one that has no author." She waited. Walter pulled a folded page from his coat pocket. It was brittle with salt and time. A crude sketch, 3 dots above a thin, jagged line. She'd seen a version of it before. In the back corner of one of his notebooks filed away under the Marfa Project archive, back at school. The pattern hasn't changed in years, he said. Even when the weather does. Even when the stars change position. They always appear one at a time, usually from the southeast ridge. The lights, Candace said. He nodded once. The first comes alone. Distant. A test, maybe. The second follows randomly. Directionless. But it's the third. The third one always holds center. Hovering above that ridge. And that's the one that knows you. You think they're conscious? No. Not conscious like us. But reactive. He paused. Patterned. That's what I couldn't stop thinking when I vanished. The lights don't chase. They respond. His words were nearly biblical in rhythm. Not dramatic, measured. Like someone who had practiced saying them aloud with no one listening. She scribbled a note in her journal. Third light equals response, / holds still equals aware. Reacts to change? Walter pointed out across the plain. That fence line right there used to run clean across the flat. You know why it's broken now? Candace shook her head. Because no one wants to be the one to fix it, he said. It's not just trespassers. There were reports. Ranch hands going missing in the 40s. One kid came back barefoot. No memory. Dust caked into the creases of his hands like he'd been buried. But his boots were still upright by the road. Laces tied. He pulled a stone from beneath his coat pocket. Small, smooth, oval-shaped, marked with an uneven spiral etched by blade or bone. Leave one of these where you sleep each night, he said. Something about the shape. They don't interfere when they see it. Maybe they recognize it. Maybe they just remember it from somewhere. Remember it? She asked. You talk about them like they're alive. I talk about them like they're old, he replied. Older than we think memory works. Don't mistake movement for mind. We don't know what kind of echo we're standing in. She let the wind settle around his words. In folklore, speculation is currency, but this was something else. It felt closer to a kind of reverent taxonomy. Like he was logging behavior, watching for shifts not just in light, but in motive. Walter stood up suddenly, looked toward the southern basin. No more questions tonight. If they're going to show, it'll be any minute. And if the third light holds, we don't speak. No matter what you think you see. He started walking back to the truck. And then, just before reaching the fence line again, he said one thing that wrapped around her spine like cold thread. They always do the same thing. Until they don't. The next morning, he didn't return. She waited at the gravel turnout for 2 hours before walking the path toward where they'd sat. No sign of footsteps, not even his. Just the flattened shape of where someone had rested gently on the stone. A dead moth lay folded atop it. Wings closed. No dust disturbed. Beside it, someone had placed a blue-inked note. His pen. His hand. If the third light holds, don't move. If the wind stops first, don't answer. There was no date. No explanation. And that night, alone at her camp, the stone boundary she had placed still intact, she witnessed the lights again. One, bright, low on the horizon, like a lantern seen through gauze. 2, soft, hazy. Further left, pulsing. Fainter. 3, directly ahead. Perfectly still. Then the wind died. Fully. Candace could hear her own pulse in her ears. Even the insects had stopped their rhythm. There was no hum. No clicking. Not even the sound of her breath, though she knew she was taking it in. The lights stayed just long enough to be counted. Then as quickly as they came, they shifted and vanished, not in a blink, but a kind of fading inward, like flames sinking into stone. She didn't speak. She didn't run. She simply watched. Journal open on her lap, pen held in her hand, and used. That was the first night she fully understood what Walter meant. These were not events to be solved. They were patterns to witness. And maybe, if you broke the rhythm, you became part of it. On her 5th night at Mitchell Flat, Candace began to understand a deeper rhythm in the land. Not just the way the lights appeared, but how the world around them shifted first. It always started the same. Late dusk. Wind slowing. Then silence. Real silence. Not simply the absence of noise, but a directionless flatness in the air, like even the insects knew something was wrong. Then the lights. They never arrived in a hurry. No blinking entrances, no sweeping arcs across the sky. They simply appeared, as if they had always been there and she'd just now noticed. That was the thing that unsettled her most, knowing she could look away, and when she looked back, they might be closer than before. She began cataloging each sighting like a ritual, not in awe, not in fear, but with a focused reverence. The observer documenting something ancient that refused to stay still long enough for science. Her journal for October 24th reads, 7:41 p.m., breeze still until it wasn't 7:44 p.m. First light, southeast ridge, 7:47 p.m. Second, smaller, shimmered briefly, 7:50 p.m. Third appeared at center. Held wind resumed, 7:53 p.m. That 3-minute pause between the third light and the returning wind was the stillest her life had ever felt. Even her thoughts seemed to quiet. It was as though she weren't supposed to think at all. Just notice. She stayed entirely still, eyes wide, spine straight, only breathing when the breeze did. The next morning, she returned to the spot where the third light had frozen in the sky and found them. 3 small piles of stones, arranged in triangles, each formed of local rock bleached by sun. At the center, a single line, a spiral drawn into the dirt using what looked like the edge of a boot heel. Only it wasn't her boot. And Walter had not returned. She hiked back out to the first trailhead near mile marker 19, hoping to use a payphone mounted outside a shuttered rest stop. The only signal for 15 miles. She dialed the Presidio County Sheriff's Office. "Sheriff's out on a call," the deputy said through the static. His voice was thin and dry, like his throat had been scratched by wind over years of repeating the same warnings. "I'm looking for someone," Candace said. "Walter Givens. He's been out this way, said he saw the lights." Silence on the other end, the kind that stretches too long before breaking. "You're camping out toward the flat?" the deputy asked. "Yes." "Don't." There was no rebuke in his voice, no judgment, just certainty, the kind of certainty people gain from seeing a thing they wish they hadn't. "We don't go past that basin. Not after dark. We don't make formal reports unless a body's found. And they never are." Candace lowered the phone. She wrote the words down as he'd said them. Later that day, she found Manuel, a former track inspector with silver hair and skin like paper left beneath the sun. He still lived in a trailer across from the Marfa rail yard and agreed to speak, if only briefly. He had seen the lights. "Up close. Twice," he said. "Both times, the air changed before they came. Like when you step inside a freezer. First time, he'd been with another worker. Second time, he was alone. It ain't the seeing of them that gets you," he said. "It's the moment after. After the third one holds, after the wind dies. That's when you realize something's watching back." He described a trucker who had pulled off between markers 16 and 17. Witnesses saw a white light by his cabin window. The man reportedly stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and then he was gone. "There weren't no footsteps," Manuel said, shaking his head. Truck was still running. Door open, coffee still hot, but no sign. None. Candace pressed him on the third light, whether it ever did anything. "No," Manuel said. "That's the thing. It don't move. It holds still, like it's waiting for you to decide what kind of thing you are." She left shaken. The language people used out here unnerved her, not because it was supernatural, but because it wasn't. They didn't speak of spirits or aliens or time slips. They spoke of quiet, rhythms, remembering, silence. That made it worse. That night, back at her camp, the wind died again. Candace sat cross-legged by the stone she now kept near her bedroll. It was smooth, blackened around the edge. Nothing overtly sacred about it, except that when she nestled it in fresh dust, the surrounding circle seemed cleaner, somehow, like it had been held back from age. The lights came again, almost on schedule now. First, faint, pale, floating like someone exhaling smoke in the distance. Second, much closer than the night before. Slight shimmer. Brief flicker leftward, looking for acknowledgement. Then the third, dead center. The third light this time paused. Longer than usual. 6 full seconds by her count. And for the first time, Candace felt something behind her that wasn't the wind. Something not moving, but present. The kind of feeling you get when walking through a museum and thinking you're alone, only to realize there's someone standing completely still behind a column, waiting. She did not speak. She did not blink. Only when the wind returned, sharp with grit and dry rot, did the third light fade, folding back into the flat like someone smoothing a wrinkle from cloth. Her pen scratched across the journal almost without her guiding it. She felt chilled, but composed, like a passerby who has made eye contact with something too old to speak. Later, she found a circle of dust just outside her tent. 3 new footprints inside it, bare, perfectly shaped, and pressed too precisely to be accidental. Her own boots were untouched. No drag marks. No animal trails. Each footprint pointed toward the center of the spiral, as if something had come briefly, and then left without needing to. Candace sat on the stone at the edge of camp for a long time after that. Not praying, just listening. Because she could sense it now, the truth behind the old stories. 1 light watches. 2 lights test. 3 lights remember. And always, just before they appear, the wind stops. On the morning of October 27th, Candace woke up before the sun. The horizon still dark, sky smudged with the first charcoal line of dawn. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. Not entirely. She'd sat up against the old fence post for hours, watching the flat return to stillness after the lights vanished. The wind had come back eventually, distant at first, a sigh through dry grass, a tap at her tarp, and then steady. But the silence had left something behind. The kind of stillness that doesn't recede all at once. It clings to the dust, to the throat. She stood quietly, knees stiff, hands shaky from sleep that hadn't settled. There in the brittle morning light, something new caught her eye. Another spiral. This one larger than before, drawn not beside her tent, but further out in the flat gravel, shaped with a looping precision her own heel could never make. It wasn't human perfection. It twisted slightly at the edge, almost careless, as if whatever had made it had no interest in impressing her. It simply needed to be seen. At its center, a tin cylinder, lightly buried, its top visible only because the wind had shifted a few flakes of mesquite bark. She dug it out slowly. A 35mm film canister, Kodak, vintage, heat-warped around the lip. Inside, rolled tight and still dry despite the age, pages torn from a notebook. Walter's handwriting, thinner than before, strokes trailing off in places. Uneven pressure, scrawled markings in charcoal gray. I left the edges. Let them inside me. Don't know how long I was gone. Long enough to forget what I came here to write. Not voices anymore, just a rhythm pulling joyless across the spine. The stone sees. Give it your memory. That's the only language that smells true to them. Note, the third light paused for 9 seconds this time. Spiral dust visible beyond normal range. Don't trust your center. Follow the dust curves counterclockwise. There was a final line, scratched so lightly she could barely make it out. I couldn't keep the center from shifting. I think I stepped inside a memory that wasn't mine. Candace rolled the paper gently and resealed it. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Walter hadn't just stayed out here. He'd tried to learn with them, tried to walk within the pattern, and possibly gotten lost in it. By noon, she was hiking east across Mitchell Flat. The road had long since vanished from view. Her boots left shallow impressions in the dust, but the desert floor beneath held firm. This part of the basin rarely saw rain, and even less foot traffic. Out here, direction became intuitive. There were no visible paths, just impulses, a faint break in the shrubs, a hush in the wind, echoes of a previous spiral she thought she'd imagined. Every so often, she'd see unnatural arrangements of stone, not stacked, not carved, just placed. Long pale scrapes where 2 rocks kissed end to end, forming a crooked arc, as if someone had traced the curve of that broken spiral again and left anchors across the basin floor. Eventually, she reached a small depression in the earth, dry, wide, empty. At first glance it looked like an old creek bed, sun-bleached and shallow. But as she stepped into it, a strange illusion twisted slightly in her vision. The edges of the surrounding hills appeared to bow outward. The wind didn't stop, but it seemed to pull back. And for just a second, she knew in her body, not her mind, this was the center. The spiral route had brought her here. She knelt and touched the earth. It was warm, not from sunlight, from within, and not smooth like normal sand or rock. It had that sticky cling of something disturbed recently beneath the surface, like air had risen through it. like memory had bled out there and not yet settled. When she stood, her shadow bent the wrong direction for a moment. No sun in the sky to explain why. That night, she waited again. The stars pulsed just slightly offbeat. The sort of stillness used to precede the lights did arrive, but with something else folded into it this time. A pressure behind her eyes. Not pain yet, more like static. Like her body had tuned into something it didn't mean to hear. 9:12 p.m. First light appeared. Faint, hovering to her left, not the usual southeast. 9:14 p.m. Second, directly across, nearer the dry ridge. 9:17, then the third. This one surfaced differently than usual, not rising, but folding out. Not a flicker, a hollow bloom of brightness from somewhere deeper in the dark. It held still, longer than any before. Her count reached 11 seconds before a gust of wind interrupted, just enough to move the cloth tied to the broken fence behind her, what she had once considered her outer boundary. A sound came then, not from the lights, but from the soil behind her. A faint exhale, not animal, not human, like air being let out from stone. She didn't turn around, but she felt it shift toward her. A presence not seen, not meant to be seen, but implicated by the way the light held still, as if her awareness made something deeper aware of her in return. She repeated Walter's last instruction in her head, follow the dust counterclockwise. Then, and only then, did the light flicker once. A pulse, a recognition, and recede. The pressure behind her eyes eased. The wind returned. The flat relaxed. She sat down slowly, knees folded, hands in her lap. Every part of her body shaking, not from fright, exactly, but from contrast, like she'd held something unfamiliar too close to her chest, and now couldn't tell where she ended and it began. She whispered into the dark, "I brought my memory." Nothing replied. Or perhaps, this time, that was the answer. The next morning, she found a single stone placed beside her journal. It was smooth on one side. The other side was marked with one black spiral, broken at the bottom, as if even now, whatever left it, still refused to close the loop. Candace began losing track of time around her 10th night on Mitchell Flat. Not in a dramatic, disoriented way, just in moments. A stretch of silence that seemed to last minutes, only to realize a whole hour had passed. Or walking the edge of camp to check her stone markers and returning to find the kettle had cooled, untouched. She blamed it on fatigue. Her sleep came in fragments. Short dreams pulled tight to the edge of waking. Sometimes she awoke with words already written in her journal. Her own handwriting. Phrases she didn't consciously remember setting down. Memory isn't tethered to the one who lived it. Echoes don't ask permission. There's a silence meant to be heard. She tried to laugh that last one off, chalk it up to poetic residue from her folklore days. But the words stuck, like burrs between thoughts. A silence meant to be heard. That was the part no textbook ever warned about. It wasn't the presence of the lights that unnerved her anymore. It was what preceded them. That slow hush blowing across the soil minutes before they came, like a curtain being pulled just slightly open. She had come to anticipate it now, not just by watching the horizon, but by feeling it. The skin behind her ears would tighten. The roots of her teeth would pulse, just once. And the insects, always chirping, always alight, would cease in unison. That's when she knew the lights were nearby. On October 31st, she experienced a blackout. That was the word she used, blackout. Not sleep, not faint, not trance. It began as usual. Early evening, watching the ridge, logging her notes. She'd just finished boiling water for coffee, sat by the large western stone, and looked up, and when she next opened her eyes, it was morning. The sky already blue-gray, the wind tugging softly at the tent flap. Candace sat inside her tent, boots still laced, water bottle half drained, her tape recorder blinking slowly. At first, she thought she must have simply nodded off, but something about her limbs felt out of sync, as if they'd moved longer than she'd remembered, and returned just before she caught herself waking. She pressed play on the recorder. 2 hours of static. Over and over, a faint pulse. Not electronic hum, but distant breath. Like someone exhaling through cloth. Then, clear as a bell, her own voice. They come to remember what we've forgotten. Spoken calmly, not afraid. Flat, even with warmth beneath it, as if she'd been answering a question. But she had no memory of saying it. None. She replayed the clip 6 times. Same tone, same rhythm, like it had always been meant to be spoken. That afternoon, she drove into town with the sole intention of grounding herself. Just one conversation with someone who could tether her back to certainty, however briefly. She returned to the same diner she'd visited her first evening, Davis's, across from the rail line. Half the booth sat empty. The waitress brought lukewarm coffee without asking. At a corner table, an older man sat reading a copy of the Big Bend Sentinel. Worn hat, face leathered by living with the land. His eyes flicked up once when she entered, but didn't linger. Only when her recorder slipped from her coat pocket and hit the floor did he speak. "You a reporter?" he asked, not unkindly. "Researcher," she said. "Just folklore." He gave a slow nod. Then, after a pause, "You're looking for Walter Givens." The way he said it, flat, declarative, unsettled her more than she'd expected. "He was my mentor," she said. "I think he's out there." Still, the man took a sip of coffee. "He came back once," he said, "about 4 years after he went missing. Folks don't like to admit it, but we saw it. Middle of the week, came into town alone. Eyes clearer than glass, but he didn't speak. Drove his truck east, said he had something to return. And 4 hours later he was back, down past the junction toward Alpine. Tires were clean, truck cold. He was bleeding from the nose, but he didn't notice until someone pointed it out. He didn't elaborate, just stared down into his cup." "You mean he never left that stretch of road?" she asked. The man shrugged. "Can't leave something once it's joined your shape." Then he looked up and said one last thing. "That place don't want your body. It asks for your rhythm. Once it's got that, it'll use you to remember." She drove back to Camp Dizzy with the implications. Memory, rhythm, use. These were not normal words for old men killing time in diners. She couldn't eat that night, couldn't sit still in her tent. The lights didn't come that afternoon, nor the one after. But strange things began to happen in their absence. Charcoal appeared in her journal. Smudged sketches she did not make. Always the same 3 oval shapes, off-center, tilted, above a jagged line that had come to mean the ridgeline. Between the ovals, her own tent, unmistakable in outline. Always smaller than it should be. She began smelling things that didn't belong. Rain, fresh sage, wet wood, none of which had touched Mitchell Flat in weeks. One night, she found her hair braided. Tight, careful, unlike anything she could do herself. No footprints but her own. No brush displaced. No wind strong enough to strip grit from her camp. But the circle around her sleeping space was always clean in the morning. Like something wanted her untouched. Not out of kindness. Out of clarity. Candace didn't consider leaving. Not fully, but by the second week, she understood that exit wouldn't be up to her. She had not recorded audio since the blackout. She'd replaced the film in her camera 3 times, but never took a photo. She understood, intuitively, that direct capture was not safe. That evidence reduced something vast into symbol, and that the lights didn't like being reduced that way. You wrote, you watched, you remembered, but you did not explain. And you absolutely did not answer unless you understood the question first. Whatever the lights were, phenomenon, echo, presence, watcher, they learned through witnessing. And the silence was an absence. It had become a question, a ritualized blank space, shaped for those who know how to listen. That night, before sleep, she placed her hand lightly on the black spiral stone by her pillow and whispered, "I don't want to know your story. I want you to witness mine." The wind didn't answer. But behind her eyelids, something nodded. Candace began mapping the sightings. They had never been quite random, she knew that much. But after nearly 2 weeks on the flat, she could feel a pattern tightening in the space around her. A rhythm pulling itself together. She wasn't seeing more lights now, but she was recognizing sooner when they were near. It would begin with the same signs, a weakening of sound, a low thrum just under breath, and then that pressing pause in the air like someone waiting to speak a name they weren't sure they owned anymore. The lights had seen her, and just as quietly, they had started following her rhythm. Walter's final journal pages were veering into something half language, half dream. She'd returned to the tin cylinder hidden beneath the spiral. Curled inside were torn leaflets soaked with graphite and sweat. None were dated. Some had been started, crossed out, reworded in a strange looping cadence. But one stood apart, the handwriting still clear, letters slower, more centered. Walter had stabilized something long enough to write this. I found the watching stone. It does not block them. It does not summon them. It only sees who arrives. I think it's old. Older than the hills. Maybe older than soil. Maybe it's not even a stone. Just a memory pretending to be one. If the third light holds, don't follow. Come back by the stone. Don't look for a door. Return to the watcher. Walter was never cryptic for sport. If he'd left these words, they mattered. Candace laid her maps out beneath late afternoon light, aligning sighting locations against land cuts, stone markers, and the strange spirals that kept reappearing near her camp. 3 clusters formed, almost aligned in a wide arc across the eastern basin. At the heart of them was a sliver of high ground barely charted. Locals called it Los Manos, the hands. A short string of upright stone formations that protruded from the dust, like fingers reaching out. Named by ranchers many years ago for their shape. But, she had noticed, most refused to speak of them now. They leaned too far in. The woman at the gas station had once whispered, "Stones shouldn't lean like that into wind." On November 3rd, Candace set out on foot toward the hands. It took her the better part of the evening to reach them. The wind trailed her most of the way, not steady, but elastic. Sometimes near, sometimes far. Never quite gone, but never comforting either. She followed a path marked more by absence than trail. Cleared dust, piled stones, places the grass bent wrong. And then, there they were. 5 stone columns, taller than they appeared from a distance, each swollen at the midpoint like knuckles. For leaned awkwardly toward the west, as if listening. The largest stood still, half buried, flat on one side like it had once been sculpted and then forgotten. She stepped up to it carefully, ran her palm over its surface. It was cold, not from shade, but by choice. The stone absorbed no warmth. It didn't give it. It existed, somehow outside the laws of temperature. This was the one, the watching stone. She sat at its base and placed her journal in her lap. The sun was just kissing the edge of the basin, the land soaked in orange and rust. Her compass needle jittered slightly in its casing, even while her feet remained still. One last entry, she told herself. Then I walk away. But as she wrote, a low tremor filled her chest. Not pain, not fear. A tone. She didn't hear it through her ears. She felt it through the bones behind her ribs. A pressure that wasn't pressure. A sound that had no audible sound. She capped her pen, closed the journal. The ridge had already dimmed. And then, they appeared. 3 lights. No warming flicker. No dance. Just a quiet arrival. One above the ridge. White. One to the left. Pale amber. One ahead of her, far too close. They formed that familiar spread across her field of view. Nothing blinking. Nothing moving. Just 3 foreign stars, in places stars didn't belong. The third held still. Longer this time. As she counted, a shift stirred behind her. Not wind. Not animal. The stars above her bent ever so slightly out of alignment. And Candace realized, she was no longer observing this event. She had become part of it. Something was watching back, and this time, it was not asking her to be quiet. It was asking her to listen for what she brought. She reached out and laid her palm firmly against the watching stone. And inside her mind, or somewhere adjacent to it, a pulse of warmth registered not as heat, but as recognition. Her chest stopped aching. Her breath settled. And like a sleeper falling backward into something unmeasurable, she remembered. Her father teaching her how to skip stones near Lake Buchanan, how he'd said silence wasn't empty. It was full of waiting things. The pages of her grandmother's prayer book, worn soft under thumb, how the corners smelled of cedar and soap and thyme. The sound of Walter's voice from that first field class, teaching them not what folklore was, but what it did, what it kept. Echoes, reminders, patterns. Candace felt, without understanding, this was her offering, her memory. And for that moment, the third light pulsed. Not bright, not loud, just once. A beat, a brief hum of acknowledgement, a remembering. When she opened her eyes, the lights were gone. No fading, no flight, just empty sky again. Candace stood slowly, dizzy. The wind flowed low and steady around her ankles. She was sweating, though the air had cooled. She walked a wide circle around the stone, careful not to step inside the space where the light had hovered. And for the first time since arriving, she felt it, release. Not departure, Not banishment, but permission, like she had not passed a test, but agreed to its terms. That night, she dreamed of spirals that never closed, of hands drawn in dust, palms facing upward, waiting for stories to be placed gently in them. She dreamed of Walter, sitting beside her by the watching stone, eyes skyward, voice quiet as breath. "We aren't chosen, Candace. We're collected." Candace left Mitchell Flat in the early hours of November 5th. There was no final confrontation, no flash of light or voice from beyond. The flats simply released her. The sky was overcast that morning, soft with gray tones. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when she packed her things. Her stone circle remained undisturbed. Her journal pages were clean, and her recorder, untouched since the blackout, slept in her pack beneath folded clothing and worn notebooks. She did not bring the camera with her. There would be nothing to show, only things to carry. Back in town, no one asked where she'd been. At the gas station, the same woman handed her change and nodded once. Not with approval, not concern, just awareness. At the diner, the older man reading the Big Bend Sentinel wasn't there. A different man sat now, younger, quiet. He kept his eyes down. The only sign that anything had occurred at all came from the sheriff himself, who passed Candace as she crossed Main Street. His window was down. He didn't stop, but lifted 2 fingers from the wheel and said, simply, "You stayed quiet. That's good. Nothing more. No questions. No explanations." In Marfa, silence wasn't evidence of doubt. It was a sign of respect for what wasn't yours to claim. Candace checked into a motel 2 towns over and slept for 13 hours. Dreamless, deep. Her body recovered, but something beneath it remained unchanged. Altered wasn't the right word. It was something settled, like sand after a long wind. Back at the university, she presented her notes as originally intended: folklore archives, oral testimonies, behavioral mapping of recurring phenomena in low-populated spaces. She logged the interviews. She shared the patterns. She even described a few of the silent nights. But the core, what happened after the lights began responding, she left out. Not out of fear, out of fidelity. Some things in folklore aren't lies or literal events. They're instructions. Stories disguised as shapes. Teachings buried in rhythm. Candace knew the difference now. Months passed. Her peers reviewed the work with mild interest. No one outside West Texas truly believed in the Marfa Lights, at least not beyond the mirage theories, thermal gradients, headlight reflections, magnetic desert anomalies. But Candace didn't mind. She never claimed to prove anything, only to remember what others had forgotten. One professor called her work inconclusive. "No proof, no closure," he said. She replied, quietly, "Closure's not the point. The rhythm is." He stopped speaking after that. Sometimes she would catch things the others missed, sounds in academic recordings that others labeled interference, shadows in field reports from unrelated cases, shapes in margins, spirals drawn backwards, phrases spoken in sleep by children who had never been near Texas soil. She began seeing the outer edges of something wider. Not visitation, not phenomenon, just response. A system not of science or faith, but attention. In February, she returned to Marfa once. Just for a day. She drove in without stopping, passing the old viewing platform on Highway 90, the city limit sign, the dry river cuts. The land had not changed, but she had. Candace pulled off at a place only she would recognize, past the ridge, beyond the 3rd marker fence. She left her boots by the rock, stepped barefoot into the dust. In her hand, a small sealed box. Inside, her journal from the flat, Walter's letters, the charcoal sketch of the broken spiral. She placed the box beneath the watching stone, rested both hands on the cold face of it once more. Felt nothing, but that was how she knew it had accepted the offering. Some memories don't need to be kept, only returned. That night, in a guest room in Alpine, she stared at the ceiling fan and thought about one final phrase she had written during those silent nights. It was one she had never read aloud, one that had arrived in the middle of the windless dark, written sideways in the margin of her page. "We don't summon the lights. They summon the shape of us." She doesn't write publicly now. She teaches, travels, takes few questions, never mentions the lights unless someone else does first. But when asked by a student what a field folklorist really chases, not just the myths, But the meaning, she answered slowly. There are stories shaped like warnings and others shaped like doors. The ones shaped like doors don't open toward you. You enter only when the silence answers back. The lights still appear. People still go out to see them. The viewing platform remains. Pamphlets restocked, studies rewritten. Pilots report flickers on radar that don't match known entities. Photographers leave with multiple exposures and no explanation why only one set shows 3 lights, blurry, veering outward, as if avoiding capture. No one has captured them properly. They aren't meant to be caught, just witnessed. And always, they come in 3s. One appears, another follows, the third waits, and then the wind dies. Locals know the signs. Those who live near the flat still teach their children, never whistle after dark. If the red cloth's not blowing, go home. And if the third light holds, don't speak. Because it isn't the light that will break you. It's the silence made in your name. Candace no longer keeps a recorder. She stopped keeping journals. Some memories are not meant to be told. Some have already been spoken and are simply waiting to be remembered again. Pause. There are no final explanations in stories like this. Only patterns. Only footprints in sand that weren't there yesterday. And lights. 3 of them. Still out there, blinking slow against the desert miles. One for those who come. One for those who listen. And one for those who remember. Analyze the above script as in social media or YouTube SEO expert and generate high-quality, high CTR title description and tags for the above script.